When mortality risks decouple, why I suffered a hemorrhagic stroke despite CVD&CKD risks Part 1, number 1682, the 11th of June 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, mortality diseases. Preface for readers, eat more protein and vegetables. Eat less red meat and processed food. Reduce portions if overweight. Eating a little less will not hurt you, overeating for yours will. Exercise daily. Walk at least 7,000 to 8,000 steps. Drink 85 to 100 ounces to 0.5 to 3.0 liters of water daily. Sleep 6 to 7 hours each night. Manage stress. Avoid draining people and unnecessary conflicts. Put your health first. Wealth, fame, and power mean little without health and life. A clinical paradox. One of the most unexpected findings from my own longitudinal health data is that my hemorrhagic stroke occurred at a time when many of my conventional health indicators were improving, and rather than deteriorating. By the time of my pontine hemorrhagic stroke in June 2025, my calculated cardiovascular disease CVD risk and chronic kidney disease CKD risk had already declined substantially after years of lifestyle modification and metabolic improvement. Based on these trends alone, one might reasonably expect that the probability of experiencing a major vascular event should have been decreasing, yet I suffered a hemorrhagic stroke. This apparent contradiction led me to ask a fundamental question: must all mortality risks evolve together? My data suggests that the answer may be no. Instead, different mortality risks may decouple over time. A person can successfully reduce chronic CVD and CKD risks while still carrying a substantial hemorrhagic stroke risk if persistent mechanical stress on the vascular system remains unresolved. In my case, systolic blood pressure remained at a relatively high plateau for nearly 2 years before the stroke. This was not a single isolated spike but a prolonged period of elevated mechanical loading. During the same interval, glucose control and other metabolic variables remained relatively favorable, allowing my CVD and CKD indices to continue improving. The metabolic system was recovering while the mechanical system remained under chronic stress. Weighted addition models versus multiplicative models. This observation also led me to reconsider not only the physiology of these diseases, but also the mathematics used to describe them. My CVD and CKD risk models are based on weighted addition equations, and which each contributing factor adds independently to the overall risk according to its assigned importance. This mathematical structure reflects the nature of these chronic diseases, where vascular injury accumulates progressively over many years through the combined effects of hypertension, hyperglycemia, obesity, inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, and other long-term metabolic stresses. In contrast, I developed a new stroke index based on the multiplicative interaction among glucose, pulse pressure, and systolic blood pressure. New TSI stroke equals glucose/120 times pp 45 times SBP 120 times 0.7, and like the weighted addition models used for CVD and CKD. This formulation assumes that stroke risk emerges from the interaction of multiple simultaneously elevated variables rather than from their simple accumulation. The multiplicative structure reflects the concept that mechanical and metabolic factors amplify one another. Under this framework, persistent elevation of systolic blood pressure can disproportionately magnify stroke risk even when glucose and other metabolic variables remain relatively well controlled. Different pathophysiology of CVD, CKD, and stroke. From a pathophysiological perspective, CVD and CKD are much more closely related to each other than either is to hemorrhagic stroke. Both primarily represent chronic vascular remodeling driven by long-term hypertension, endothelial dysfunction, arterial stiffness, inflammation, insulin resistance, and cumulative metabolic burden. The heart and kidneys deteriorate together because they are components of the same vascular network and respond similarly to decades of chronic injury. Hemorrhagic stroke is fundamentally different. Rather than representing gradual deterioration alone, it often represents the acute structural failure of a cerebral vessel after prolonged mechanical loading. The vessel may tolerate elevated pressure for years before eventually reaching a critical threshold where rupture becomes unavoidable. The triggering event occurs within seconds, but the underlying process may have been developing silently over a much longer period. From an engineering perspective, the distinction becomes even clearer. CVD and CKD resemble material fatigue or creep, where microscopic damage accumulates gradually over time until organ dysfunction becomes Clinically apparent, their weighted addition models naturally reflect this cumulative process. Hemorrhagic stroke resembles fracture mechanics. A structure may appear stable while internal stress progressively weakens it until its remaining structural reserve is exhausted, at which point catastrophic failure occurs abruptly. The multiplicative stroke model is intended to capture this nonlinear interaction among the forces acting on the vascular system. 3 indices and 3 different biological processes. Viewed from this perspective, the 3 indices are not measuring the same biological phenomenon. The CVD index reflects long-term cardiovascular remodeling and degeneration. The CKD index reflects long-term renal microvascular deterioration. The new TSI stroke reflects acute dynamic instability rising from the interaction of mechanical and metabolic stresses that may trigger vascular failure. Their trajectories therefore should not necessarily be expected to coincide. This interpretation may explain my own clinical paradox, despite successfully reducing my long-term CVD and CKD risks. Through sustained metabolic improvement, I remain vulnerable to hemorrhagic stroke because the prolonged mechanical burden imposed by elevated systolic blood pressure persisted. The weighted addition models correctly reflected improvements in chronic vascular and renal health, while the multiplicative stroke model remains sensitive to the continuing mechanical stress placed on the cerebral circulation. The decoupling hypothesis, the broader implication extends beyond my personal experience. Health should not be represented by a single score or a single disease model. Instead, it should be understood as multiple interacting physiological trajectories that may converge, diverge, or decouple over time. Perhaps the most important lesson from this analysis is that different mortality risks do not necessarily decline together. Improvement in metabolic health does not automatically eliminate mechanically driven vascular risk. Patients may become metabolically healthier while remaining structurally vulnerable. If this hypothesis is correct, then the long-term trajectory of systolic blood pressure may be more informative than any isolated measurement. A prolonged plateau of elevated mechanical stress may gradually erode vascular reserve until a critical threshold is crossed and catastrophic failure occurs. Conclusion: in this view, CVD and CKD primarily reflect progressive vascular deterioration that is well represented by weighted addition models, whereas hemorrhagic stroke reflects the acute failure of that vascular system when interacting. Mechanical and metabolic stresses exceed its remaining structural reserve, making a multiplicative model more appropriate. Recognizing this decoupling may help explain why catastrophic events can still occur despite otherwise successful long-term disease management, and may encourage a more trajectory-based approach to risk assessment in future medicine. Epilogue: immediately after my hemorrhagic stroke, while sitting in my hospital bed at Stanford, one question kept repeating in my mind: how could this happen? For 17 years, I had devoted myself to understanding my own body. I had collected millions of data points, built mathematical models, and believed that I understood my major health risks, yet I still suffered a pontine hemorrhagic stroke. That question stayed with me for almost an entire year. For nearly 360 days, I worked 15 to 16 hours each day trying to answer that single question. I repeatedly examined my data from different angles, tested alternative hypotheses, and even diverted into other areas of medical research simply to clear my mind before returning to the problem again. The search was often frustrating, but I refused to accept an explanation that did not fit the evidence. I believed that if the data were truthful, then the answer had to exist somewhere within them. During that time, I wrote nearly 400 papers related to stroke, neuroscience, metabolism, blood pressure, glucose, and vascular disease. I repeatedly examined my data from different perspectives, searching for the missing piece that could reconcile my observations with reality. Today, I believe I have finally found a plausible explanation. The answer was not hidden in a single measurement but in a direct comparison of different disease trajectories. Although my stroke model uses a multiplicative formulation while my CVD and CKD models use weighted addition formulations, comparing them side by side revealed an important physiological insight. The dominant driver of mortality risk had changed. For many years, metabolic abnormalities were the primary determinant of my overall health risk. Through sustained lifestyle improvement, those metabolic risks gradually declined, and my CVD and CKD indices improved accordingly. However, during the same period, systolic blood pressure remained on a prolonged plateau at a relatively elevated level. Dominant contribution to my health risk quietly shifted from metabolism to mechanical vascular Stress. In other words, blood pressure gradually took over from metabolic dysfunction as the principal driver of my stroke risk. My cardiovascular and kidney risks continued to improve because they reflected long-term cumulative metabolic burden through weighted addition models. My hemorrhagic stroke risk, however, remained elevated because the multiplicative interaction of systolic blood pressure, pulse pressure, and glucose continued to impose persistent mechanical stress on the cerebral circulation. Looking back, the stroke no longer appears contradictory. It was not the failure of 17 years of research. Rather, it was the consequence of a changing physiological landscape in which the dominant mechanism of risk had shifted. I had successfully controlled one major pathway while another gradually became the limiting factor. This realization may extend beyond my own case. Disease mechanisms are not static. As the body changes over time, the dominant driver of risk may also change. Understanding when that transition occurs may be just as important as measuring the risk itself. This is part 1.